we're here in studio today with two prominent and quite fabulous gentlemen from the South Asian community who are going to tell us about their stories. Daniel, Waleed, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having us.
So I want to demystify what it means to be gay. So that's the objective here today. So are you guys up for the challenge?
Absolutely.
Of course.
Let's do this. So when did you realize that you were gay? So maybe Daniel, we can start with you.
Looking back in retrospect, as a child, I was always told I was. And you know, when you're younger, you don't know what being gay means. I remember I would ask certain people when I was being called gay, and they'd say, oh, it just means being happy. So I was always told I was different, but I never really came to the understanding that I was gay and that I liked men until I was much older, until I was actually negotiating my identity and kind of growing into it in my early 20s. So that's when it happened for me, in my early 20s.
Isn't that interesting? What about yourself, Waleed?
I think that I sort of had that realization probably around the same time in terms of applying a label to it or being able to identify in some way. But as far back as I can remember, I always had interests that were different from my brothers, and my parents were always like, why do you want to play with the doll? Why do you want the dollhouse? Why do you want the pink Barbie car? And I think at that time, you know, you didn't really have a word to necessarily use to say I am such and such. But I remember the very first time I came to know of that term was actually in a way where somebody else was using it in a way to insult somebody. And I heard the word, and it was actually the word lesbian. And I remember going back to look it up and ask, you know, what does that even mean? And thinking, oh, well, that's not necessarily a bad thing. And kind of feeling like, you know, there's something that I relate to with this.
Isn't that interesting? Now, Daniel, you mentioned you were being told. Were you being told this by other children?
Well, I mean, you get bullied in the school ground, of course, you know. But even at home, even in my family, you know, my mother is the youngest of 14, so I grew up with a lot of cousins, and so a lot of them were much older than me by the time I was growing up. So I was always bullied by them as well. So it was very clear to me that I was very different from the other men, and that I wasn't a typical boy. Again, with the dolls, pink, my obsession with Madhuri Dixit, you know, like these things were, they questioned them, you know. And I do remember being taken to the doctors. My parents were trying to figure out what was wrong.
Oh, isn't that interesting?
I do sympathize with them as an adult, but you grow up with these experiences and you know that you're different.
Well, when you mentioned your parents took you to the doctors to figure out what was wrong, is it because they themselves couldn't identify with what was happening with you or didn't want to?
I just don't think they knew. They had no idea. I remember when I told my mom I was gay, she had no idea what being gay meant. What does it mean? She told me when she came to Canada in the 70s, that's when she was exposed to a large gay community. When she was growing up in the Fiji Islands, nobody was open about their sexuality. So they had no idea. It wasn't, you know, identifying with something implies some sort of understanding on some level. They had none of that. They really had none of that. They had no idea what being gay, lesbian, transgendered was.
Oh, isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Waleed, you mentioned your parents were questioning you when you picked up the dolls and they were sort of trying to figure it out. Was it the same experience for them in your opinion? Do you think that they were either not ready to accept that term or perhaps didn't even know what it meant?
I think my parents their marriage was a love marriage, and so I think by definition they sort of broke barriers in some ways within their families, and so I think they were kind of ready for something a little bit more in their face that was going to push them a little bit more. So my parents were, from a young age for me, were supportive and never really made me feel like I was some sort of freak. They were very welcoming of the fact that I was a little bit different, but this is before we necessarily knew what words to use. So when I actually came out to my parents, to my mom initially, she was a little bit taken aback by the fact that I was so comfortable and so just ready to say it because I had worked up that courage over a couple years. But I think that she had a much easier time with it than my father did. He took some warming up. But now my parents are incredibly supportive and they've met my partner, and it's a different thing altogether.
So it's been a positive journey from the sounds of it. But I'm curious, now you also mentioned your mother and you also mentioned your mother, and of course they were I guess perhaps they were more open to this and were a lot more embracing of it, whereas I'm curious to know, because with the South Asian culture, it in and of itself was a taboo, and the question remains, does it still remain a taboo? But specifically with respect to the men in your life, what's the reaction? What was the reaction? What do you still find as the reaction with the concept that it might still be somewhat tabooish, even though we talk about it as if it's not?
Well,
Daniel?
it definitely is taboo. That's for sure. And I think it's because people still don't have an understanding of it, and as a result, they're not open to it. And so when I told my dad, now my dad was one of the guys that bullied me. Well, I think he thought he could bully the gay out of me. You know, if I scared you enough, you wouldn't want to be, as if it was a choice. And I think they understood it as a choice. So raising a son who wanted me to be interested in golf and all these sorts of things, and I could not stand golf. I wanted to dance, you know? So I think for him, it was very traumatic when I told him. He had a very negative reaction. He threatened me. And, you know, of course, at that point, I was very confident. So it didn't matter to me what he said. I strictly told my dad as a courtesy. And we've never spoken about it since. At the beginning, you know, the first few months after I told him, he would Google. My mom told me, you know, your dad's Googling how you became gay. And I felt so bad because they have no knowledge and they don't know where to go to get any knowledge or who to speak to or how to get the tools. But after that, he's never brought it up. He's never spoken about it, and I've never spoken to him about it either. But I'm very proud, and I make no qualms about hiding my personality or what I wear or who I speak to. So I'm very much out there, whether he likes it or not, yeah.
So how is the relationship today?
You know what? My father and I have had a very complex relationship. There's a lot that's happened to us as children. So not having a positive relationship with my father has nothing to do with my sexuality. It has to do with a lot of other things. But I think, you know, you do want your dad to be there for you sometimes. You know, when he does make the effort to, you know, how's work going? Are you on a diet? Because, you know, he always wants me to lose some weight. But, you know, he cares and he shows that to me. And I said, you know what, as long as you acknowledge me as your son on some level, that's all I can really expect from my father. And I think that's okay.
That's wonderful. Yeah. That's actually quite wonderful. Yeah. And Waleed, you, of course, had a very positive sort of reaction to your dad. Tell us about that.
My dad, like first and foremost, we were very close and we're very similar in our personality. And so I think that he understood that if I was saying something like this to him, I wasn't going through a phase or, you know, trying to sort of figure out who I was. Like at this stage, I was coming to them fully formed, knowing, you know, the terminology, knowing the history of this community. I had already been involved with our LGBT center at Laurier, which is where I went to university. And I think that is really what gave me the tools to be able to talk to them and not just say, like, drop a bomb on them, but then to come back with, here's some resources.
Okay, so you were able to inform them and perhaps provide that education, which Daniel's parents seem to seek outside.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
I'm curious because both of you are in, like, you're in the media industry, you're studying to be a chef, very creative sort of endeavors. Is there a reason you chose these professions?
Yes and no, I guess. For me, a creative expression, I think, goes hand in hand with when you're counterculture in some way. Okay. So when, you know, you have this need, this drive inside of you to say something and find any medium to do that, you know, you find creative outlets. So whether that's photography or whether that's cooking or whether that's, you know, working in the traditional sort of marketing communications space on a corporate side, all of that taps into that creative urge.
Okay, and what about yourself, Daniel?
You know, media is that creative outlet for me. The opportunity came to me, and I wasn't really seeking it out, so to speak. It came to me, and I took it up, and it's allowed me to express myself. It's allowed me to find more comfort in who I am. And of course, I developed that identity, and I explored parts of my sexuality much later in life, whereas most people would do it much earlier. So media has definitely been a part of that identification process for me.
That growing process for you.
Yeah.
Do you think there's certain professions that still hold strong stereotypes, and perhaps in the community, in the LGBT community, and for yourselves, they're perhaps a little bit, you're less inclined to go towards those professions because they're not as open to being gay?
You know, that's so interesting. I just think that stigma about being gay is everywhere. It could be in any profession, in any culture. So, I mean, when I face it, I try to demystify it as much as I can, or I try to face it head on. And, you know, I get very, you know, expressive about it. But I don't think that there's anything that's not within my limits. You know, I'll go anywhere for work. You know, if I need to be a doctor and I decide to be one, I will go to school, I'll study, and I'll become a doctor. And if I face that stigma, you know, I'll face it head on. But ever since I've come into the media space, I mean, there's so many gay men and women in media. You know, it's been such an open and an accepting space, especially in the South Asian community, might I add. You know, the industry,
nice
the South Asian media industry really embraced me, and it was so comforting.
Okay, well that's awesome. Now, of course, we know tragically the recent shooting that happened in Orlando, and of course that was at a gay nightclub, and there was actually a link that was being communicated on social media. They were trying to sort of, there was Islamophobia versus you're looking at, of course, being homophobic. And your thoughts around that? I'll start with you, Daniel.
You know what, when I heard of the shooting, I knew it was coming as a hate crime. It just spoke of it right from the beginning. And having been in certain situations like that, bullied, you kind of were able to pick up on certain signs and markers that really identified this as a hate crime. And so I feel really sad that that had to happen. The community is really coming together to kind of face it. It's tragic that people have had to pass in order for us to come together like that. But I think, you know, there are lessons to be learned in all of this. And it's unfortunate that people had to die, but it shows how much work there's left for us to do. I mean, we're still sitting here in 2016, and I'm thinking to myself, it's 2016, how is this still happening? I just can't even fathom that. Yeah. But you know, it might be until 2036 where we'll finally find the acceptance that we're looking for. So there's work to be done. Being here, speaking to you about it, having this platform is a part of that. So it's about being vocal, about being open, and continuing that discussion.
Excellent. What about you, Waleed?
I mean, I definitely echo what Daniel's saying, and then also just understanding that it could have been anywhere. Like, we look at it as this isolated incident, but I mean, me and my friends were out that exact same night at a club on Church Street, and when we got, like, we all got the breaking news on our phones, and it really hit very close to home because it made you get that sense that it could have been you, it could have been your friends, it could have been your loved ones, and you know, all of this can really just be traced back to one individual that, you know, who didn't have the right tools to be able to deal with whether it's his own sexuality or just this phenomenon existing in society. And rather than approach it in a way that would have been healthy, constructive, it became a destructive, violent outburst.
Well, it was interesting because some of the media reports you hear is that, you know, was this about some people being homophobic, but then of course there was no, this is the, you know, it started to shift to becoming Islamophobic. And so from people I spoke to, they were actually quite upset about it because they wanted it brought back to being homophobic because at the end of the day they felt that that was the issue. What about the LGBT community? What are they saying with respect to this?
Well, you know, at the time that the crime was initially reported, it wasn't even spoken of being a hate crime. You know, people automatically went to terrorism and Islamophobia. And then as details started to unfold, we realized that he was a closeted gay individual. You know, he was visiting the nightclub, and that the fact that this was a hate crime really came to some sort of prominence with the reporting. So I think there was a sense of outrage. You know, we are very upset that we were completely written out and completely taken out of the whole context of that situation. It wasn't even mentioned that it was a gay nightclub. And so it just speaks to that experience. You know, if we can be disregarded so quickly, even with a crime that was against our community, we have to speak that much louder in order to have our voices heard, you know?
Well, I'm also curious because at the end of the day, could it also be a struggle that he was facing with respect to accepting his identity?
Absolutely,
right?
It definitely was. Yeah.
Internalized homophobia is a very powerful thing, and which basically means that although you yourself might identify as, you know, gay or lesbian or transgender within that spectrum, you are not comfortable with that identity enough to actually accept it, and then, you know, you
creates that rage in you.
Absolutely, and you know, for lack of a better word, act out in a manner that is harmful, whether to yourself or others. And I think that to try to sort of separate homophobia from Islamophobia is difficult in this type of situation because Islamophobia, or rather, you know, the large Islamic structure, if you will, when it comes to dealing with homophobia and dealing with the reality of LGBT individuals, is very, very, very dated. And there needs to be an advancement in that conversation, because otherwise this type of incident is not going to be the end of it.
Well, I'm curious to know, absolutely, and I'm curious to know, because we have about a minute or so left, there are probably a number of viewers out there who are struggling with this identity, and I'd like to know what you'd like to say to them. So the people who are struggling with their identity perhaps have supportive families, perhaps don't, especially since South Asian culture is, you know, of course has its own challenges, being from a South Asian sort of background. What would you say to them, both of you, just very quickly?
I would say find your own tribe first and foremost. Find your support, find the people that love you, find a community, and then once you are comfortable enough, work on your family to the extent that, you know, you want to. We are not here to spend our life trying to convince somebody of something that they will not get convinced of. But at least you should just be honest about who you are and the reality of who you love and, you know, who you want in your life, and then give them the tools and then leave it up to your family to figure it out.
Well said, Waleed. What about you, Daniel?
I absolutely agree with that. And to continue the conversation with your family, I think it's very important to be open. I think sometimes we have a tendency to get very defensive, especially when we're telling our family about our sexuality. I think it's important to be open to the conversation and realize that your parents are coming to the table with a certain number of values and beliefs. They're coming to the table with a belief system. Be open to that. And I think if you can understand your parents, you can have a positive dialogue. And if not, you'll feel comfortable knowing that where you stand and who you are is what you're going to be for the rest of your life, and you won't have a problem. And that's what helped me out of experience with my family, just understanding that I can't expect them to unlearn what they've been living for with 15 years in a minute.
Very good
So
point.
just be open.
Very good point.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both for being with us today.
Thank you.
Hopefully the audience out there has taken something very positive from this. It's all about communication at the end of the day, and also keeping an open perspective. So stay tuned, we'll be right back.